Got some notes from gave me like 3. Pretty easy. No.
Let's begin. So we move forward today with the analysis of chapter 12. The working title of today's lecture will be on the origins of a nickname. And the nickname is monetarism or monetarist. So we'll see who got this nickname and why. I already mentioned that monetarism is a particular school of thought in macroeconomics. And as you can imagine, at least in the culture where I come from, probably all other cultures, people who give you a nickname usually do it in order to make fun of you. And we're going to see in a moment who are those people, those nasty people who consider monetarists to be silly, ridiculous people as part of ideas, and why, and how monetarists respond to that. So we're going to say something about monetarist economic theory. I can just give you a hint here that there's those people who wanted to make fun of them were Keynesians. Keynesianism was the ruling paradigm in economic theory from 1940s to 1970. Keynesians were those people who first invented this. We'll see why. So last thing that we discussed in the previous class was Irving Fisher's theory of exchange. And what we dubbed the naive or simple quantity theory of finance. So Irving Fisher's equation of exchange. So the name is idea. Quantity of money multiplied by velocity of circulation corresponds to price level multiplied by the quantity of resources produced. And the reason why this version of the theory is very often called the naive or simplified quantity theory of money. First, why quantity theory of money? It says that the main factor that determines the price level is the quantity of money, supplied money. That's number one. Number two, why simplified? Because it takes some liberties to impose some kind of limitations to the economic system that do not always obtain in reality. Primarily, the Fisher's version of the, not the original version, but the way how it is interpreted, assumes that the velocity of circulation is constant, and assumes that even in the short term, the quantity of goods and services produced is constant. And if this is so, then the only effect of any given fluctuation in money supply would be corresponding fluctuation in the price level. These two variables are the only two variables that can change. So whatever, since the equation has to balance out, whatever happens to M will have to happen to P. If money supply increases by 5%, the prices will increase 5%. Price level goes down 10%, the price level will. If the money supply goes down 10%, the price level will go down 10%. Now, I told you a part of the story last time about why this was dubbed originally as simple or naive quantity theory of money. For now, we want to do two things today. The first one is, if we assume that this is indeed correct, this is indeed the case, is there any way for us to translate this model, equation of exchange, into our old model of aggregate demand, aggregate supply analysis? What is the relationship between the two? So, aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So we're going to do that first with this simplified version, and then we're going to relax some of these or these two unrealistic assumptions and see how the model gets complicated and less easy to handle when we get close to reality. So why is this important? Because we want to, in a certain sense, bring together Keynesianism and monetarism to see that they use the two different kinds of theoretical languages to talk about the same thing, about spending and consumption and income. Okay, so that's the idea. So let's start. First, just take a look at this equation. What does it tell us? It tells us one simple and almost tautological plane. The left-hand side of the equation is the total money supply multiplied by the velocity of circulation. That's a total money demand, total monetary demand for goods and services. That's total demand. That's how much money people spend. That's $100 times, let's say, rate of turnover of 6. Every monetary unit changes hands 6 times, so the total spending is $600. On the right-hand side, you have the same thing, just looked at from the suppliers, from the sellers' point of view. So you can say that this is a total monetary demand, this is total income. And they have to balance total demand versus balance total income. It's a simplest possible accounting. Just in order to understand why this necessarily must be the case, just look at one isolated transaction. And then you will see that the same applies for the totality of all transactions. I buy a cup of coffee from you for $5. $5 is both the value of my spending for a cup of coffee, and in the same time, it's your income that you receive from me. It's $5 for both things. In the same time, just looked from my point of view of a buyer and your point of view as a seller. So buyer's spending equals seller's income. So then just expand that to the economy as a whole, and you get the totality of all transactions. Could be looked at as the total money that is spent on all goods and services, or as the total income received by all sellers. There is no difference whatsoever. So now you can see already here that it stands to reason. It seems intuitive that you can say in a certain sense that this M times V equals AD, aggregate demand, total demand for goods and services like that. And that P times Q equals aggregate supply, total supply of goods and services. In this case, that's unambiguously and unequivocally true. Here, it is kind of true, but with some complications that we will see here. But in principle, it's correct. In principle, that's the way that we want to think about it. So now, can anyone tell us how Keynesians define aggregate demand? Anyone remember? Total expenditure, total spending in the economy. How do you calculate it? Remember this? Consumer spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus net exports. It's the expenditure method of calculating the GDP. Remember, you can calculate GDP as incomes, profits, rents, wages, interest, or you can calculate the forms of spending. Consumer spending, investment spending, government spending. One and the same thing. Remember, my spending is your income, your spending is my income, if you like from me. But now we can say that from a monetarist point of view, AD equals N times V. So you can say that in a certain sense, N times V equals C plus I plus G plus N. Now you can see that the main difference between Keynesianism and monetarism is that monetarists look at the aggregate demand from a standpoint of monetary policy. This variation, they attempt, or they think that the aggregate demand should be influenced by changes in money rather than by changes in government spending. Remember, what is the main plank of the fiscal policy is increasing government spending. And an economy is in trouble. You increase government spending, and then the entire sequence kicks in that increased government spending increases demand for consumer goods because people who were unemployed now get some additional money. They spend that money on consumer goods. This increases the demand for consumer goods. Then the increased demand for consumer goods increases their prices. So profit margins increase. Then the consumer goods industries increase their orders from their suppliers of intermediate goods, and so on down the line. The prosperity spreads outward from the initial government intervention to the entire private economy. It spills over from government spending to private spending. So that's fiscal policy. So now, this is the first hint of why Keynesians ridiculed monetaries. In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, it was universally accepted that fiscal policy has a primacy, that monetary policy is inefficient in boosting the aggregate demand. It is increasing that. We'll see in a moment why, but that was the original idea. And then when Milton Friedman and a couple of other guys came up with this idea that you can use the central banking policy and money as a way of doing the same thing that Keynesians want to do to fiscal policy, they were dismissed and ridiculed, some kind of fringe minority that goes against the scientific consensus of all experts. Another instance. Scientific consensus changes from day to day, week from year to year, so on. So that's the origin of the growth. That's the origin of the conflict. It's not so much the conflict over whether government should pursue some policy to optimize economic development to prevent recession, but rather over the means to achieve that. Whether it's fiscal policy, aka government spending, is preferable to or monetary policy, printing money, lowering interest rates, whatever to use. Okay, now let's translate by still remaining within the confines of the first simplified version where V is constant and Q is constant. How can we translate that into the aggregate demand, aggregate supply trend? It's very simple. Remember, CPI is on the price axis of the diagram. Real GDP or Q is on the horizontal axis. You remember why you can use interchangeably physical quantity of production and real GDP figures. They're interchangeable. Because real GDP figures they account for inflation, so it doesn't matter actually from year to year. And if you control for the price level, year-to-year variation in GDP will be reducible to variations in quantity. So let's say that in 2019, nominal GDP at current prices is $300. And then in 2020, GDP 2020 is $320. Does this mean in 2020 prices? Does that mean that we are better off that the economy grew between 2019 and 2020? It doesn't necessarily, because GDP is prices times quantities. So 320 could be reached by quantity decreasing slightly and price level increasing significantly, or by quantity remaining stable and prices increasing somewhat, or quantity increasing while prices remain stable. Just by looking at the nominal GDP figures, you cannot disentangle the influence of increases in physical productivity from the influences of the increases in prices for higher GDP figures. So then what we do in order to be clever, we say that, what we're going to do, we're going to select a baseline year, whatever, let's say this 2019 is a baseline year. We're going to use the prices from that year, And then calculate the GDP for 2020 by multiplying the quantities of goods and services produced by 2019 instead of 2020 prices. So then it's apples to apples comparison. Although real GDP figures are in dollar terms, they are influenced only by the variations in physical quantity. So that's the reason why you can use here either physical quantity or real GDP, doesn't matter. They are essentially the same because of this clarity. So now, aggregate demand curve is the same. What else? What is the short-term aggregate supply curve? It's the same as the long-run aggregate supply curve. Because Q is constant even in the short run. So that means that the aggregate supply curve is vertical. Doesn't change as a function of changes in prices. So this is your macroeconomic equilibrium here. And what happens is very simple. When you want to strengthen the aggregate demand is M times V. V is constant. Then the only way how you can increase aggregate demand is by increasing money supply. What happens to the aggregate demand curve when money supply goes up? Shifts to the right. This is your point 2. New macroeconomic equilibrium. What changes? Nothing changes, just prices increase. Quantity of goods and services remains the same. If, on the other hand, money supply goes down, velocity has to remain constant because that's the definition that we imposed at the very beginning. Thus, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, and you get in new macroeconomic equilibrium with a lower price level. This is just a depiction of the David Hume story that we discussed last time. You know, that the good fairy visits you over the night, visits everybody, and gives to everybody 2 times as much money. What happens the next morning is this thing here. You move from point 1 to point 2. The same goods and services that the economy produces and that you can buy, just at higher prices. Or if some evil demon visits us, all of us, over the night and steals 50% of all our money, are we going to be poorer next morning? David Hume says no, actually, just the prices will go down 50%, and we will be buying the same quantity of goods and services just at lower prices. So that's point 3. That's a very simple and mathematical modeling of this trivial story that I told you last night. And the constraints are here. The simplicity of the model is dictated by those very strict constraints that velocity and quantity cannot be changed. Now, in reality, it's not as easy. Even monetarists do not say that it's always like this. They argue that velocity can change in principle, but in a predictable fashion. You can, by and large, predict which way the velocity of circulation will move, and you can account for the factors that influence the changes in velocity of circulation. So you relax the assumption of complete fixity or constancy of velocity of circulation, but you still argue that you can get a pretty good handle of in which direction it's going to move. You can use certain principles to deduce, to predict this velocity of circulation. What happens with the quantity? When you relax the constancy assumption here, what changes is that now you say, yes, in the short run, quantity of goods and services produced will change as a consequence in the changes in money supply price level, but only in the short run. So now with these 2 assumptions in mind, number 1, velocity predictable by and large, but not fixed. And number 2, quantity changing in the short run. As a function of changes in money supply. So now let us look at what the model looks like, this translation of. So these two assumptions are now revised about velocity and behavior of the relativity. What the model looks like once we do this. So one way to look at it is now that you can solve m times v equals p times q. Now we want to solve to see what happens to prices. So we solve the prices, we solve the equation by p. We get m times v over q. And that tells you that you have two kinds of forces, inflationary and deflationary forces. If you want to see the price level increasing, any of the following three factors can contribute to that. Increasing money supply. Increasing money supply, everything else remaining the same, it's inflationary pressure. Increasing velocity of circulation, everything else remaining the same, increases the price level. Because it's above, it's in the numerator. So when V increases, M and P remain the same, M and Q remain the same, P will increase. And Q going down, price will increase. That's inflation is the same quantity of goods and services chasing fewer number of products, fewer products, because the price per unit have to go up. So inflation. Yeah. Deflationary tendencies. That means the tendencies that lead to a drop in the price level. Now you just flip it back. Either money supply goes down, or velocity of circulation goes down, or productivity increases. By the way, the third possibility here is happening in the United States a lot in the 19th century. We had a secular trend, which means a long-term trend of declining prices. Why was that the case? Because we were on gold standard, and the quantity of money, gold being the money, increased by the same rate by which the production of gold was increasing, just 2%, every 1.5 to 2% a year. Whereas productivity, physical productivity, Q was increasing 3, 4, 5%. That means the price level was declining as the denominator was increasing faster than the numerator. Price level was down and down. Okay, so now let's see how can we translate this into the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. There are two situations here that can happen. CPI, Q. We have a long run aggregate supply curve. We have now the short run aggregate supply curve is different than the long run aggregate supply curve. Why? Because the quantity can change in the short run as a function of prices. So with a higher price level, you can get a higher productivity in the short run, but in the long run, still you cannot. And now let's assume that this is a macroeconomic equilibrium. Aggregate demand curve number one. Here is your equilibrium. Here is the CPI level, the initial equilibrium. Here is the usual. So now what happens? What happens now if the aggregate demand increases? For whatever reason. That means that the aggregate demand curve will shift right. So this can happen for two reasons, two principal reasons and a variety of their combinations. Either money supply can increase and velocity remaining constant, or money supply remaining constant while velocity increases, or both of them increase. As the effects will be in principle the same, always M times V, aggregate demand is M times V will increase. If any one of these three possibilities happens, the aggregate demand will increase, which means that the aggregate demand curve will shift right. And now you see there will be a difference here. Difference between the long-term and short-term macroeconomic equilibrium. So what is the new short-term equilibrium? This point here, number 2. That you have a higher level of prices and a higher real GDP. This is not nominal. This is real stuff. More stuff will be produced in the short run with some inflationary boost, let's say increased money supply, then the economy can afford in the long run based on real factors, real productivity. Number of workers, their productivity, machines, and raw materials, availability of technologies. There's this gap that quantity 2 is greater than quantity 1. This is long run, this is short run. Short run is greater than long run, that's what we do. That's called, if you remember, inflationary gap. What is inflationary gap? That's an overproduction caused by temporary stimulus, temporary boost that spending gets from monetary policy. So you have higher inflation, that's the reason why it's called inflationary gap. And the gap is in the direction of overproducing too much. So there is a surplus of goods and services produced that cannot be sold in the long run at a given price level. So now what happens in this type of situation? Discuss this. There are 2 ways in which you can do that. If you do nothing now, monitors say you should be doing nothing, what's going to happen? And why? Very good chance to get particularly good participation rate. Can you help? Can you help? What's going to happen now and why? You're here on this unsustainable long run trajectory. In the long run, you cannot stay here. You cannot be producing Q2 in the long run. You have to go back to Q1. How are you going to
do an excess of goods? So would you have an excess of goods?
Yeah, you have excess of goods. How are you going to get rid of the excess of goods?
You have to lower prices.
Go ahead.
Increase government spending.
That's one idea. Increase government spending or decrease.
You said increase, right?
If you increase, what's going to happen? You move even further.
Oh, wait, increase.
So that decrease. That's the Keynesian idea. Contractionary fiscal policy. So you move the aggregate demand curve back here. You reduce production. You have a recession. So you have to go into a recession no matter what. As a consequence of that, you will have a recession. Why would you have to go into a recession? Because you cannot afford to sell everything that you produced. Everything that you produced thus far was made by buying the factor of services, by buying the labor hours, by buying electricity, raw materials, machines at high prices, And now you cannot sell all of that because people's income has not increased. You cannot sell all of that at high prices. So there are surpluses. So the unemployment will have to result that you cannot sustain this level. You will have to reduce your production. Long run. You will have to fire some people. You have to scale back the size of your operations. You will have to reduce production. This will be shown as the movement of the short-run aggregate supply curve. You reduce production, supply will have to go down. So the supply curve will shift to the left, and the quantity supplied will move from quantity 2 back to quantity 1. You will have probably a recession, high rate of unemployment. When you reduce production, you will have maybe to cut wages. When you cut wages, what happens to GDP? Remember the income method of calculating GDP. Profits, wages, rents, and so on. All of these go down now. That means the GDP things. And also, if you have the unemployment, you have also the investment spending going down. So, for a variety of reasons, the economy will go into recession until we reach a point that the short-run aggregate supply curve intersects here with the new aggregate demand curve and the long-run supply curve here, 0.3. So you will end up with the same ironclad quantity 1 that you can produce. You cannot make miracles. In the short run, you can fiddle with it a little bit. Eventually, it will come back to bite you. But what is the price of that? Of this whole enterprise? Eventually, that you will end up with CPI, with inflation, which is even higher than this intermediate stage. Why it has to be higher? The quantity goes down. You go into a recession here. You reduce your productivity from Q2 to Q1. If you don't change the money supply and velocity circulation, price level has to go up. So then the final result will be that you would move from 0.1 to 0.3, but just not directly as in the original simple model, but rather via this circuitous detour here to 0.2. You have this pulse of economic development, this boom and bust, in a sense, from the equilibrium to inflationary gap and back again. So this is like a rudimentary monetarist theory of business cycle. So stability of prices will make sure stability of prices is the main criterion. Zero inflation is the main criterion of stability of the real aggregates production. As long as you keep your prices stable, your productivity of your economy will stay along the long-run aggregate supply. So that's one thing that can happen. One type of monetary disequilibrium that can happen. The other thing, the opposite thing that can happen. Same setup. Initial equilibrium, short-run curve, initial aggregate demand curve. And now we say the money supply goes down. And let's say the velocity remains constant. What's going to happen? M times V goes down. Aggregate demand curve shifts this way. Now, this is the initial price level here. This is the Q1. Now, the new short-term equilibrium departs in the opposite direction. The CPI level drops. The quantity is lower than the potential GDP. It's the long-term or sometimes natural GDP. Natural. That's the maximum possible productivity of the economy at a given level of population size, technological advance, and availability of fibers production, and stability of the political and economic system. And this is called, this quantity 2 is smaller than quantity 1. Short-run quantity is smaller than the long-run quantity. This is a recession. This is called a recessionary gap. If you allow money supply to decline, or if slowdown in the velocity of circulation occurs, a recession will occur, because the spending will shift. So now what can you do here? One thing that you can do fiscal or monetary policy to try and move the aggregate demand curve back to its initial position, to close the recessionary gap that way, to move into this direction, right up here.
Would you do the opposite of what you did there? So you would increase government spending to kind of stimulate?
Yeah, that's the opposite. That's the mainline Keynesian proposal here. If you're in a recessionary gap, you increase the aggregate demand through fiscal policy to go back from initial to this optimal position. But what else can happen if you do nothing? So you have now the prices are lower, you cannot afford to sell at the current market prices. Recession will occur, the analogous situation from the one that we had before. But now the problem is that we have a shortage of goods and services. So what will happen now is, according to monitors, that the supply will increase. The supply curve will shift. Right. And you will end up with this point here. With the same, you will close the recessionary gap, you will increase your productivity, and the price level will drop even further. While the price level will drop even further, because the quantity increases here, all other things can control the price level will go down. Now, why Keynesians don't believe that this can happen, and monitors do believe it? That's an interesting story. That's key stuff. Everyone remembers this. You remember this sticky wages stuff, sticky prices, sticky wages. Monitors believe, this is important, that prices and wages are by and large flexible. That means if demand for goods and services in a given industry are reduced 5%, it would be relatively easy for the employers to reduce the wages across the board 5%. So then the reduction in GDP will be much lower. You can allow the economy to adjust to lower prices by, they can charge lower prices without reduction in their productivity by paying lower wages to their workers. You don't have to reduce your production. 2025 plus, if you produce $1,000 worth of value, and now the demand is $900, so reduce 10%. Your wages 10%, my profit goes down. So then we can maintain the same physical productivity as before, just lower prices. Go ahead.
Oh, sticky wages would make that a problem.
Yeah, sticky wages would make that a problem. If you have a long-term contracts for wages, and I promised you $1,000 wages, and I cannot reduce it to $900, what else can I do in order to remain in business? Why? Increase the unemployment to reduce production. So that's the reason Keynesians don't believe that. Keynesians believe in sticky wages. Monetarists believe in flexibility of prices and wages. That's why they believe that the economy can recover on its own. Recession again. One more thing before we close today. Circling back to this initial problem of the nickname, how they got the nickname. The main point of contention here is the interpretation of this thing. What monetarists say is that velocity of circulation is predictable, in a sense, and even to the degree that it is not, you can make up for a decline in the velocity of circulation by increasing the money supply. So Keynesians and monetarists agree that you should try and keep the total spending at a constant level or increasing level, M times V should be as high as possible. And then the problem is, of course, that one of the components of total spending goes down, it's velocity. Then the question is whether you can make up for this decline by increasing the money supply. It goes 5% down. Whether you can now maintain the total spending at the previous level by increasing money supply 5%. Do that well. Monetarists say, in principle, yes. And that's why they believe that monetary policy could be efficient in a situation of recession. Keynesians say unequivocally no. You cannot. And that's why monetary policy. And what is the argument that they advance for this? There are two arguments. The first one is, both of them have to do with asking the question, why the velocity of circulation slows down typically before a recession and during the recession. The answer is simply that people are scared and pessimistic. Velocity of circulation measures the frequency of payments, and people buy and sell less, the frequency of payments will go down. The average rate of turnover of every given monetary unit will slow down because people don't know what the next day will bring, because the uncertainty exists, pessimism and cautiousness bring. So it will slow down. Now, what's going to change? That's one reason. The second reason is that typically what happens then is that the price level goes down. If there is inflation, it slows down. If there is a stable price level in a recession, the price level can come down. Inflation. So there is this close connection between bad economic times and a decline in price level. Now, if consumers believe that tomorrow's prices are going to be lower, even lower than today's prices, what is rational thing for them to do with the money that they have? You postpone your purchases, even if you're not afraid, even if the primary reason for your reluctance to spend is not that you are uncertain about the future, and you increase the size of your cash balance as an insurance policy. That's a rainy day money. But situation is uncertain, you reduce spending and withdraw money in your cash balances to have some additional cushion. And even if that's not the case, you may say, aha, prices are going to go down tomorrow. Why would I be a sucker to spend $100 tomorrow when this $100 worth of spending today will be worth much more tomorrow at lower prices? I have the same amount of money, purchasing power of that money will go up if I expect prices to decrease. So then Keynesians say, you cannot fight against these two problems by printing more money and giving that money to people. They're not going to. They're just going to withdraw even more money into cash balances. They're not going to increase their spending only because they have more money. If they're uncertain about the future, you cannot force them to spend. They use this metaphor like a farmer or a rancher who would like to force his horse to drink water. So, yes, you can take your horse down to the river, but you cannot force it to drink. It's the same topic. You can give money to the people, but you cannot force them to spend. So that's the reason why Keynesians believe that such a monetary policy is inefficient in a recession. You have to overcome these two problems first, and then you can think about increasing the money supply as solving any kind of problem. How you overcome the problem? You overcome it by fiscal policy, by increasing government spending and restoring faith in the economic system, restoring optimism that way, and then the aggregate demand. Okay, so for them, this idea that you can just use monetary policy to fight off recession is silly and ridiculous. Monetarist was somebody who believes that money can solve all the problems. And this changed, of course, in 1970s. And the fortunes shifted sharply between markets. When Milton Friedman wrote an oil price in 1776, 80% of macroeconomists switched some form of Keynesianism to some form of monetarism. And then in 2008, back again, revival of the fiscal policy in the Obama. Okay, we can almost stop the time. Any final questions about this?
With the stimulus check funding, is that kind of what's happening right now?
Yeah, that's a Keynesian policy. But there is another angle here. Are you assuming that politicians are doing what they're doing now because they read Professor Keynes and Keynesian textbooks and deep understanding of fiscal policy? They want to spend $2 trillion because they care too much about the models instead of the demand, supply, niceties of long-term and short-term stuff. They like to spread the candies to their voters to bribe the interest groups and to get popular and get re-elected once again. That's why Keynesianism is a very convenient theory for politicians, much more convenient than others. So whatever you want to do for your own selfish reasons is actually based on science. You can weigh it there.
Love that.
So it's basically.
No.
You working with it? Yeah. I already gave it to her.